You won't believe this. A neighbor actually cut down a 145-year-old oak tree on my property, without permission, and when karma struck back, she had the audacity to sue me. Hi everyone, and today I'm sharing one of the wildest HOA stories you'll ever hear, about a tree, a neighbor who thought she owned the world, and how her arrogance came crashing down literally. I live in one of those quiet, picture-perfect suburban neighborhoods, the kind where the mailboxes all match, kids ride their bikes in slow circles on the pavement, and every house seems to be in silent competition for best lawn on the block. It's peaceful, calm, and just far enough from the city that you can still hear crickets at night. Most days, the loudest sound you'll hear is a lawnmower or a dog barking at the mailman. It's the kind of place where time slows down a little, where people wave from their driveways, and you actually know your neighbors by name, or at least by what car they drive. On the corner of my property stood something truly special, a massive oak tree, so wide at the base that it would take at least 3 people holding hands to wrap around it. It towered above every house in sight, with thick, sprawling branches that looked like something out of a painting. Its leaves were lush, deep green in summer, fiery orange in autumn, and when the sun set, the light would catch through the branches like stained glass. That tree wasn't just old, it was ancient. According to local records and a forestry inspection, it was around 145 years old, maybe even a bit older. That means it had been there long before any of us, before the neighborhood existed, before the roads were even paved. It was like a silent witness to history, storms, seasons, families, generations. Every time I looked at it, I couldn't help but feel grounded, like it connected the past to the present in a way only nature can. In the mornings, I'd sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and just listen. The rustle of its leaves, the birds nesting in the branches, the squirrels that treated it like their personal amusement park. During summer, its shade kept my yard cool and calm. It was where my dog liked to nap, and where neighborhood kids sometimes gathered to play hide and seek. That tree meant more to me than most people realized. My grandfather had actually helped care for it decades ago when he owned the property. He used to say, "You don't own a tree like that. You just take care of it for the next generation." I took that to heart. I made sure to have it checked every couple of years by an arborist. It was healthy, strong, and solid. Not a single sign of disease or instability. It wasn't just part of my property. It was part of my life. I remember one particular evening, late summer, golden light spilling across the lawn, when my neighbor, Mr. Lee, stopped by with his granddaughter. She must have been 6 or 7. She stood under that huge tree, looking up in awe, and said, "It's like a castle." He smiled and told her, "That tree's older than your great-grandpa." It was that kind of tree, the kind that made people stop and feel small in the best possible way. But every peaceful story needs a villain, right? And in my case, her name was Karen. Karen moved into the neighborhood about a year after I bought my house. She came from another state, one of those people who introduces herself not with hello, but with, "I'm the new HOA board member." From the moment her moving truck pulled up, I could tell she was particular. You know the type, the kind of person who measures their grass height with a ruler and reports your trash cans to the HOA if they're left out 5 minutes past pickup time. At first, I tried to be friendly. I waved, offered to help her with a few heavy boxes, even brought over a welcome basket with some baked cookies. She thanked me, but there was something in her tone, polite, but clipped, as if she was already analyzing my property for violations. Within a week, she'd already sent an email to the neighborhood group chat suggesting new standards for lawn uniformity. That was the start. Karen quickly became the unofficial neighborhood watchdog, or dictator, depending on how you look at it. She had a clipboard she carried everywhere, scribbling notes about everyone's yards. If a car was parked on the street overnight, she'd report it. If someone had a basketball hoop visible from the road, she'd complain. It was like she was on a personal mission to turn the neighborhood into a sterile postcard version of itself. At first, I found it kind of funny, annoying, sure, but harmless. Until one day, she turned her attention to my tree. It started small. During one of her evening walks, she stopped in front of my yard, staring up at the oak with this look of disapproval, like the tree had personally insulted her. The next day, she mentioned it casually. "That old thing looks dangerous," she said. "You should think about taking it down before it falls on someone's house." I laughed it off, explaining that I had an arborist check it regularly, and it was perfectly healthy. But her tone was sharp, almost smug. "Well, I'll have to check the HOA bylaws," she said. "We can't have unsafe structures in the neighborhood." Unsafe structures. She called a living, thriving, century-old tree an unsafe structure. At first, I thought it was just another one of her control freak moments, something she'd complain about and move on from. But she didn't. Every time we saw each other, she'd bring it up again. "That tree is dropping leaves into my yard. It's blocking my sunlight. I think it's causing property damage." Always something new, always exaggerated. It was like she couldn't stand that something on my property, something beautiful and natural, wasn't under her control, and I could tell it bothered her that the HOA had no jurisdiction over it, since the tree was completely within my boundary line. I even had the property survey to prove it. Still, she kept pushing. She'd take photos of it, send them in HOA emails, even corner other neighbors to ask if they felt unsafe living near it. Most of them thought she was overreacting, but no one wanted to confront her because, well, it's Karen. You just don't win arguments with people who think they're always right. But I never imagined how far she'd actually go. I thought it would all stay at the level of petty complaints, angry emails, and passive-aggressive comments. I didn't think she'd ever actually do something about it. Oh, how wrong I was. Because little did I know that beautiful, ancient oak, the heart of my property and a piece of living history, was about to become the center of the most insane, unbelievable neighborhood drama I've ever lived through. And it all started with Karen and her obsession with control. Karen moved in across the street on a mild spring morning, the kind of day when the whole neighborhood smelled like cut grass and fresh paint. The moving truck pulled up around 8 a.m., and by 10, she was already barking orders at the movers like a general leading an army. She was in her early 50s, with a sharp bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and an expression that looked permanently unimpressed. You could tell, even from across the street, that she wasn't the smile and wave type. From the very first day, I had a feeling she was going to be a lot. She moved into one of those pristine corner lot houses, all beige siding, white shutters, and an HOA-approved mailbox that looked like it came straight out of a catalog. But the real giveaway wasn't the house, it was the clipboard. Yes, a clipboard. I'm not kidding. On day one, she walked around her new property, and then everyone else's, writing notes on a clipboard like she was conducting an inspection. You could see her squinting at lawns, fences, garden gnomes, even trash bins. She didn't even bother introducing herself before she started assessing the neighborhood, like she was the sheriff of suburbia. Within a week, she had become what I can only describe as the self-appointed enforcer of the homeowners association, or as everyone started calling her behind her back, the HOA queen. Now, our HOA isn't that bad. We have a few basic rules. Keep your lawn trimmed. Don't park RVs on the street. No crazy paint colors. Simple stuff. But Karen took those rules and turned them into her personal religion. Every few days, she'd send out long-winded emails with subject lines like friendly reminder about proper fence maintenance or urgent. Decorative flags must comply with HOA standards. She'd quote random sections of the HOA handbook like she'd memorized the whole thing. It was almost impressive in a terrifying way. I tried to stay polite. I figured she was just one of those overly involved neighbors who'd eventually calm down once she settled in. I waved when I saw her, complimented her flower beds, even replied kindly to her passive-aggressive group emails. But Karen wasn't looking for friends. She was looking for control. She lived for rules. You could tell it gave her a rush, the power of catching someone doing something wrong. I once saw her taking photos of a neighbor's mailbox because she thought it was half an inch too tall. Another time, she left a printed warning on someone's front door because their garden hose wasn't coiled neatly enough. The rest of the neighborhood started to avoid her. People would peek through their blinds before stepping outside, just to make sure Karen wasn't lurking with her clipboard. Barbecues became quieter. Kids stopped riding their bikes near her house after she yelled at them for making tire marks on the sidewalk. And of course, she somehow ended up on the HOA board Within 3 months of moving in, nobody else even ran against her, probably because no one wanted to deal with her wrath. It was like she'd been born for this role. She loved the authority, the illusion of being in charge. At first, I kept my distance. I figured as long as I followed the basic rules, she'd have no reason to bother me. My yard was neat, my house was up to code, and I never caused trouble. But people like Karen don't need a reason, they just need a target. And apparently, her next target was me. It started with little things. One afternoon, I came home to find a note taped to my door. In bold letters, it said, "Your trash cans are visible from the street. HOA Guidelines Section 3B. Please relocate them immediately." I sighed, moved the cans behind my fence, and thought that was the end of it. 2 days later, I got an email. This time, it was about the color of my front porch light, apparently. Soft amber wasn't in compliance with the HOA's approved color temperature list. I didn't even know that was a thing. She kept finding tiny, meaningless things to comment on. My lawn edging, my mailbox placement, even my Halloween decorations. Once she sent an email to the entire neighborhood, claiming someone had hung decorations too early, and included a blurry photo of my front porch. I laughed it off at first, but it was starting to get exhausting. Every week, there was something new. I started joking with friends that Karen probably had a wall in her house covered with photos of everyone's yards, like she was running a neighborhood version of the FBI. Then one morning, I caught her standing near the edge of my property, looking up at my oak tree, the massive, beautiful one that had stood there for over a century. She had her clipboard in hand, pen poised, staring at it like it had committed a crime. I walked outside, coffee in hand, and asked, "Everything okay, Karen?" Without looking away, she said, "That tree looks unstable." I raised an eyebrow. "Unstable? It's been here for over 100 years. She turned to me, eyes narrowed. "Old doesn't mean safe. If that tree ever fell, it could hit my house. The HOA might need to step in." I tried not to laugh. "The tree's on my property, Karen. The HOA doesn't have any say in that." She gave this tight, thin-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "We'll see about that." Then she scribbled something down on her clipboard and walked away. I stood there, half amused and half unsettled. It was just a tree, my tree, but something about the way she said it made my stomach drop. From that day on, I noticed her paying extra attention to it. I'd catch her taking photos from across the street, walking slow laps around it like she was gathering evidence for some kind of investigation. She even cornered a few neighbors, asking if they felt unsafe living near it. Most of them brushed her off, but you could tell she wasn't letting this go. She had found her new project, and if I'd learned anything about Karen by then, it was that once she decided something was her mission, she'd stop at nothing to get her way. Little did I know that was only the beginning, because when Karen's obsession with control met a 145-year-old oak tree, it was only a matter of time before the situation exploded, and the fallout would be bigger than anyone could have imagined. It started small, just tiny comments here and there, the kind of remarks you'd brush off if you didn't know better. But coming from Karen, they carried a certain weight, a tone that made it clear she wasn't just making conversation, she was testing boundaries. The first time she brought it up, I was out front trimming my hedges. Karen wandered over, clipboard in hand as always, pretending to admire my garden. She squinted up at the oak tree towering above us and said, almost casually, "That old tree is kind of an eyesore, don't you think?" I looked up at it, the sunlight filtering through its leaves, the way the branches swayed gently in the wind, and I couldn't help but smile. "Actually," I said, "I think it's beautiful. It's been here longer than any of us. Gives the yard some character." Karen didn't smile back. She just hummed, tight-lipped, and said, "Well, some of us prefer a cleaner look." Then she walked away, scribbling something on her clipboard. I thought nothing of it at first, but the next week, she brought it up again, this time in a tone that made me pause. "I think that tree might be dangerous," she said, arms crossed, staring at it like she was diagnosing a patient. "If it fell, it could crush my house. Have you ever thought about removing it?" I explained, as calmly as I could, that I actually had the tree inspected regularly by a certified arborist. It's completely healthy, I told her. Strong roots, no rot, no disease. It's safer than half the trees in this neighborhood. But she wasn't satisfied. You never know, she said. Sometimes old trees just give out. Her voice had this almost gleeful edge to it, like she wanted something bad to happen so she could be proven right. That's when I started realizing this wasn't about safety. It was about control. Over the next few weeks, she began weaving the tree into every conversation. If I was watering my plants, she'd call across the street. Still haven't done anything about that hazard, huh? If we had a neighborhood meeting, she'd find a way to bring it up, saying things like, I've noticed some property owners are ignoring potential dangers that could impact nearby homes. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Then came the emails. Oh, the emails. Karen loved her HOA email threads like most people love coffee. She sent one to the entire neighborhood titled Potential Safety Concerns in Common Areas. And while the tree was entirely on my land, she wrote, There's a large, aging oak near my property line that poses a risk to multiple homes. She even attached photos, taken from different angles, showing my tree leaning slightly in one direction. It didn't actually lean dangerously. It was just the natural curve of the trunk. But to someone unfamiliar with trees, her message made it sound like a disaster waiting to happen. Neighbors started asking me questions. Hey, Karen says your tree's dying. Is that true? I'd have to explain, over and over, that it was fine. I even shared the arborist's report to prove it. That's when Karen started dropping the HOA authority line. One afternoon, as I was collecting my mail, she approached me with that familiar smug expression. You know, she said, the HOA has the right to make you remove unsafe structures. I blinked. Karen, it's a tree. And it's not unsafe. Plus, it's not on HOA property. She raised an eyebrow like she was teaching a lesson to a child. It doesn't matter. If it threatens another property, the HOA can intervene. I couldn't help but laugh. The HOA can't intervene on private property, Karen. The tree's entirely within my boundary line. I have the survey documents. It's my responsibility, not the HOA's. That clearly didn't sit well with her. She pursed her lips, muttered something under her breath, and walked away. But the next day, I noticed her outside again, this time, pacing around near the property line, with a tape measure. Yes, a tape measure. She was literally trying to prove that the tree somehow crossed into HOA jurisdiction. I walked out and asked what she was doing, and she snapped. Just confirming some details for the HOA records. It was absurd. I half expected her to start marking the ground with little flags. At this point, I started keeping records myself, photos, videos, anything to document what was happening. Something in my gut told me this was going to escalate, and I wanted to be ready. Sure enough, it did. A few days later, I got a letter in my mailbox, an official notice from the HOA. It said that a concern had been raised about a potentially hazardous tree, and that I should provide proof of safety within 14 days. It wasn't even signed by the HOA president, just submitted by a board member. I didn't need to guess who that board member was, so I forwarded the arborist's report again, along with the property survey showing the tree was entirely on my land. The HOA eventually replied, "Thank you for the clarification. This matter is closed." I thought that was the end of it. For a week or two, Karen went quiet. No emails. No snide comments. She even avoided eye contact when I waved from across the street. But her silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt calculated, like she was regrouping. And I was right. Soon, I noticed she'd started talking to the neighbors again, quietly, behind my back. One of them, a nice older woman named Judy, pulled me aside and said, "You know, Karen's been telling people your tree's diseased. Says it's dropping limbs dangerously close to her yard." That was a lie. It hadn't dropped so much as a twig near her property. But by spreading rumors, she was setting the stage, making everyone believe my tree was a menace that needed to go. She even claimed she'd spoken with the county about it, though I found out later she'd just called the wrong department and been ignored. The thing about Karen is, once she decides she's right, reality stops mattering. Facts don't change her mind. They just make her dig in deeper. And every time I thought she'd finally let it go, I catch her staring at that tree again. Sometimes early in the morning, standing on her porch with a cup of coffee. Sometimes at dusk, when the sky turned gold and the tree's shadow stretched across the street, right toward her house. I swear, it became an obsession. It wasn't about safety or rules or community. It was personal. The tree bothered her, not because it was dangerous, but because she couldn't control it. She couldn't file it under HOA compliance. It was nature, wild, old, and untamed, and that was something Karen just couldn't handle. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before she did something reckless. Still, I didn't think she'd actually go that far. Not yet. It was a Thursday morning, completely ordinary, at least at first. I remember the sky being that soft gray you get before it rains, the kind that makes the air smell like wet earth and leaves. I had an early meeting that day, so I left for work before sunrise. As I backed out of my driveway, I glanced at the big oak tree, like I always did. Its huge branches stretched wide across the yard, rustling softly in the breeze. It looked strong, eternal, like it would stand there long after I was gone. But when I came home that afternoon, something felt wrong. You know that eerie feeling when something is off, but your brain hasn't caught up yet? That was me, pulling into the driveway. The air seemed heavier. My yard looked emptier somehow. My stomach sank before I even understood why. Then I looked toward the corner of my property and froze. The oak tree, the one that had stood there for 145 years. Gone. Completely. Gone. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I literally blinked, thinking maybe I'd parked wrong or was looking from a weird angle. But no, where that beautiful giant once stood was nothing but an ugly, splintered stump. The ground was torn up with tire tracks, deep ruts cutting through the grass. There was sawdust everywhere, piles of it, scattered like ashes. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I dropped my bag and just stood there, staring at the destruction in disbelief. That tree wasn't just wood to me. It was part of my home, part of my history. My grandfather had cared for it. It had shaded my family for generations. Seeing it hacked apart and gone, it was like someone had ripped out a piece of my life. I walked closer, kneeling beside the stump. The rings in the wood were wide and bright, each one representing a year of life, over a century of growth, gone in a single morning. I felt this wave of shock and anger crash over me, all at once. And then I noticed something else, small, bright orange spray paint markings on the ground. They looked official, like someone had measured and marked the area before cutting. My first thought was that maybe the city had done it by mistake, though that made no sense since I'd received no notice. Then I saw her, Karen, standing on her porch, arms crossed, sipping from a mug like she was admiring a job well done. I stormed across the street, my heart hammering. Karen, what happened to my tree? She didn't even flinch. She looked at me with a smug little smirk and said, "You're welcome." Excuse me. I could barely believe my ears. That thing was a hazard, she said, gesturing toward the stump. I had it taken care of. You should be thanking me. It could have crushed my house any day now. For a second, I thought she had to be joking, but she wasn't smiling. She was dead serious. I felt my hand shaking, partly from rage, partly from disbelief. You what? You had it taken down? That was my tree. It wasn't on your property. She shrugged. It was a danger to the neighborhood. The HOA gave me permission. That's when I snapped. The HOA can't give permission to destroy something on private property. That tree wasn't theirs to touch. Karen rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic. Oh, don't be so emotional. It was an eyesore anyway. I did everyone a favor. A favor. She actually called it a favor. I was so furious I could barely speak. I turned and ran back to my house, straight to my phone. I needed answers. I needed proof. I called the tree removal company whose logo was printed on a small sign they'd left behind. A man answered, sounding confused when I introduced myself. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You did a tree removal at my address this morning. Who authorized that job?" He paused. "A woman named Karen, last name." She said she was the property owner and had approval from the HOA. Everything checked out as far as we knew. I clenched my teeth. She's not the owner. That was my tree. On my property. There was silence on the other end. Then the man swore softly. "Oh no. Ma'am, I am so sorry." She signed all the paperwork. She even showed us what looked like a property map. We didn't realize. My heart sank even further. She had lied. Straight up fabricated authority she didn't have. And somehow, a legitimate company had fallen for it. I asked the company to email me everything. Copies of her signature, the work order, any correspondence. Within an hour, I had it all sitting in my inbox, clear as day. Karen's name, her signature, and even a message from her stating, "I have full permission from the HOA and the property owner to remove the tree for safety reasons." The audacity was unreal. I immediately called the police and filed a report for property destruction and trespassing. The responding officer came out, took one look at the stump, and shook his head. "Wow, that's bold. Usually, disputes like this don't get this far." He took photos, my property documents, and the proof from the tree company. He agreed. Karen had no legal right to do what she did. It was vandalism and destruction of private property. As the police were talking to me, Karen actually came strutting over, still acting like she'd done nothing wrong. "Officer, you're wasting your time," she said. "The HOA supports me. That tree was dangerous." The officer turned to her and asked, "Ma'am, do you have written authorization from the property owner?" She lifted her chin. "I had verbal permission." I couldn't help it, I laughed. "From who, Karen?" "The voices in your head." Her eyes flashed with that self-righteous glare she always had. "You'll see. The HOA will back me up." Except they didn't. When the officer contacted the HOA president, he was furious, apparently. Karen had never mentioned any of this to the board. She'd acted completely on her own. That's when the officer told her, flat out, that she'd committed a serious offense. I'll never forget the look on her face, that moment when her confidence cracked, just for a second, like she was realizing she might actually be in trouble. But even then, she refused to admit she was wrong. "I did what needed to be done," she kept saying. "Everyone will thank me eventually." Meanwhile, I was left standing in my yard, staring at the stump of a tree that had stood for nearly a century and a half. The silence felt wrong without it. The yard looked empty, exposed, like a piece of its soul had been ripped away. Neighbors started gathering around, whispering in disbelief. Some offered sympathy. Others just shook their heads. Everyone knew how much that tree meant to me. It wasn't just part of my land. It was a living piece of history. And all because one woman, one petty, controlling HOA tyrant, decided she knew better than everyone else. That was the day everything changed. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. It was about principle. And I promised myself right then and there, I was going to make sure Karen paid for what she'd done. After the shock wore off, the rage set in. I wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Not after what she'd done. The very next morning, I called the local police department again to follow up on the report. The officer who had come out the day before told me they were moving forward with a criminal complaint for property damage and trespassing. But because it involved private property and the value of what was destroyed was so high, he advised me to get a lawyer involved, a good one. So I did. I found a property attorney who specialized in environmental and land disputes. When I explained what had happened, he actually went silent for a moment, like he was trying to process just how absurd the story was. Then he said, "You're telling me your neighbor cut down a 145-year-old heritage tree on your property without permission?" I said yes. He exhaled. "That's not just civil damage. That's felony-level destruction of property." We started building the case immediately. I sent him everything: the photos of the stump, the police report, the emails from the HOA, and most importantly, the signed documents from the tree removal company showing Karen's forged authorization. When he reviewed it all, he looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "You've got her dead to rights." The arborist I'd hired before came back out to reassess the damage. He shook his head the whole time. "I've been doing this for 30 years, he said, running a hand over the stump's smooth rings. This was a protected heritage tree. You can't just replace something like this. It'll take lifetimes for another to grow to this size. He wrote up an official valuation, $53,700 in estimated loss, not including soil damage, landscaping, and restoration fees. When I told Karen that number later in court, her face went pale, the first real emotion I'd seen from her other than arrogance. But let me back up. A few days after filing the police report, I went to the HOA meeting, partly to make sure they knew what their board member had done, and partly to make sure they couldn't try to cover it up. When I walked into the room, you could feel the tension. Everyone already knew. Word had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People were whispering, some looking at me sympathetically, others glancing nervously at Karen, who was sitting right at the front, pretending like she had nothing to be ashamed of. The HOA president, a soft-spoken guy named Mark, cleared his throat and said, "Before we start tonight's agenda, we need to address a serious incident involving one of our board members." Karen sat up straighter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Mark continued, "It has come to our attention that a tree located on private property was removed without permission. This was not sanctioned by the HOA in any way." Karen interrupted immediately. "It was a safety issue, Mark. I was acting in the best interest of the community." Mark held up his hands. "Karen, please, this isn't up for debate right now." But she wouldn't stop. That tree was a hazard. I've been saying it for months. I did what needed to be done. That's when another neighbor, Judy, spoke up from the back of the room. "Karen, you can't just take it upon yourself to destroy someone's property. That's illegal." The room buzzed with murmurs. People were finally saying what they'd been too afraid to say for months. You could see it in their faces. They were tired of her. Mark looked uncomfortable but firm. "The HOA does not support or condone your actions. Any legal matters that arise from this are your personal responsibility." Karen scoffed. "Fine. Be that way." She grabbed her purse, stood up, and marched out of the room like a storm cloud in heels. I remember sitting there afterward, heart still racing, feeling this weird mix of relief and fury. Relief that the HOA wasn't backing her, but fury that it had come to this at all. Over the next few weeks, the legal process began to move forward. My lawyer filed a civil lawsuit against Karen for damages, trespassing, destruction of private property, and the unlawful removal of a protected tree. He also filed a motion requesting restitution for the full replacement value, plus legal fees. Karen, in typical fashion, tried to play the victim. She sent emails to neighbors claiming I was harassing her and trying to ruin her financially. She even tried to argue that she'd acted out of concern for neighborhood safety. Her exact words, and I'll never forget this, were, "If that tree had fallen and hurt someone, I would have been the hero. Now I'm being punished for trying to protect everyone." That was her logic. My lawyer said, "Let her keep talking. Every word she says makes our case stronger." We went back and forth for months, depositions, statements, hearings. The tree company even testified that Karen had misrepresented herself as the property owner. They produced the work order she'd signed with her own name and address. It was all so clear-cut. She was guilty, and everyone knew it. But still, she acted like the world was against her. Then, just when I thought things couldn't possibly get any crazier, karma showed up. It started with a thunderstorm. Late one night, the wind picked up fast, the kind of howling wind that makes windows rattle and trees sway. Rain came down in sheets, pounding against the roofs. I was sitting in my living room, listening to the storm, when I heard it. A loud crack, followed by a deep, rumbling crash. The whole neighborhood seemed to shake. At first, I thought it was just thunder. But when the storm passed, I went outside to check for damage, and that's when I saw it. Across the street, Karen's yard looked like a war zone. One of the remaining root structures from my destroyed oak, which she'd weakened by cutting it improperly, had finally given way. A massive chunk of wood and soil had shifted, and a heavy branch that had been left piled near the stump had rolled straight into Karen's house. It had smashed through her front wall, shattered a window, and torn part of her porch clean off. Her lights were on, and I could see her standing there, staring at the destruction, drenched from the rain, with this stunned look on her face, like she couldn't process what had just happened. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The next morning, she came storming over, hair a mess, holding her phone like a weapon. "You're paying for this," she yelled. "Your tree damaged my property." I blinked at her. "My tree? You mean the one you destroyed?" She jabbed her finger toward me. "It's your responsibility. Those roots were still on your land." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "Karen, you cut down that tree. You hired the crew. You lied to them. You did this to yourself." She stomped off, yelling that her lawyer would be in touch. And sure enough, a week later, I got the letter. Karen was suing me. Yes, the woman who illegally cut down my tree was suing me for the damage caused by the very tree she destroyed. That's when I knew this story was far from over. But what she didn't realize yet was that karma had just started warming up. It was about a month after the lawsuit had started. Things had gone quiet for a while, and honestly, I was starting to think the whole situation might finally calm down. The weather had been unpredictable that week. One of those early spring storms where the sky turns dark way too fast, and the air feels thick with electricity. That evening, the wind began to howl like something alive. Rain came pouring down in heavy sheets, slamming against my windows so hard it sounded like gravel. I remember sitting on my couch, trying to watch TV, but the storm outside was impossible to ignore. Lightning flashed every few seconds, lighting up the room in bursts of white. And then it happened. Boom. It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard in my life, like an explosion or a car crash right outside my window. My whole house seemed to shudder. The lights flickered, and my heart just about stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe a transformer had blown, but when I looked outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Across the street, through the sheets of rain, I could see Karen's house, or rather, what was left of it. The corner of her living room wall was completely caved in. Bricks, wood, and insulation littered her front yard. Even from where I stood, I could see water pouring down through a hole in the roof, flooding her porch. Lightning flashed again, and that's when I noticed what had caused the damage. A massive chunk of the old oak's root system, the same one she'd butchered and destabilized when she had my tree illegally cut down, had finally given way. The roots had been holding tension underground, and with the storm's heavy rain and wind, the soil had shifted. That huge, gnarled piece of the fallen oak had rolled free, smashing right into her house like a wrecking ball. I just stood there in my window, speechless. It was surreal, like karma itself had picked that exact moment to balance the scales. The next morning, once the rain stopped, I walked outside to get a closer look. The damage was unbelievable. Her living room wall had a gaping hole, big enough to see straight inside. The foundation had cracked along one side, and parts of her roof had caved in. There were splinters of wood and shattered glass scattered all over her yard. You could see where the soil had shifted from the storm, how the ground had given way under the pressure of those massive roots she disturbed. It looked like a construction zone after a natural disaster, and in the middle of it all stood Karen, soaked, furious, and pointing fingers. Literally. She spotted me across the street and immediately stormed over, waving her arms. Her hair was wild, her slippers were covered in mud, and her voice was shrill over the dripping of rainwater. "This is your fault," she shouted before I could even say a word. I blinked. "My fault?" "Yes," she snapped. "Your stupid tree destroyed my house." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Karen, that was my tree. The one you cut down without permission. You're seriously blaming me for this?" She jabbed her finger at me, face red and trembling. "If you had taken care of it like I said, this wouldn't have happened. Those roots were still on your land. It's your responsibility." I shook my head in disbelief. "You cut it down. You hired the crew. You destroyed the roots. You caused this mess, Karen." Her expression twisted into something between rage and desperation. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," she screamed before stomping back toward her house, nearly slipping in the mud. And she wasn't bluffing. Not even a week later, I got a thick envelope in the mail, the kind you know is bad news before you even open it. Inside was a letter from her attorney. Apparently, Karen was suing me for negligence. According to her claim, I had failed to maintain and secure the remnants of the fallen oak tree, which had posed an ongoing threat to adjacent properties. She was demanding compensation for her home's structural damage, roof repairs, and emotional distress. I actually had to sit down to read it twice because it was so ridiculous. She was suing me for damage caused by her own actions. I called my lawyer immediately. When I read him the letter over the phone, he actually started laughing. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "She's really doubling down, huh?" "Oh, she's serious," I said. "She's trying to spin this like she's the victim." He sighed, clearly both amused and exasperated. "Don't worry. We'll handle it. This is textbook nonsense, and honestly, it's going to make her look even worse in court." A few days later, he filed a counterclaim. Not only were we moving forward with my original lawsuit for the destruction of the tree, but now we were also adding her for harassment, false claims, and defamation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread fast. Karen's house had been damaged by the very tree she destroyed, and now she was trying to sue the owner for it. Everyone had an opinion. Some people couldn't believe the nerve. Others were just glad someone was finally standing up to her. One of my neighbors, an older guy named Tom, came over shaking his head. "You can't make this stuff up," he said. "I've lived here 30 years, and I've never seen karma hit that fast." Honestly, I couldn't either. But if I thought the lawsuit was crazy, what happened next made it even better, because the insurance companies got involved. Karen tried to file a claim with her homeowner's insurance, saying the damage was caused by a natural event. But when the adjusters came out and inspected the wreckage, they realized the root structure that had collapsed wasn't natural at all. They could see clear evidence of human interference, saw marks, tool cuts, and disturbed soil. In their report, they concluded the damage was a direct result of unauthorized and negligent removal of tree structure. In other words, it was her fault. 100%. Her insurance refused to pay out, and that's when her panic turned into fury. She started sending me nasty letters, yelling across the street, and telling anyone who would listen that I was ruining her life. The irony was painful. She had literally done it all to herself. And every time I saw that massive hole in her wall, I couldn't help but think, that's what happens when you mess with nature and with other people's property. Karma doesn't always come fast, but when it does, it comes hard. In court, my lawyer presented everything. The survey proving the tree was on my land, the arborist's health report, the police record of her unauthorized removal, and the invoices showing she paid the tree company. The judge didn't even need long. He dismissed her claim immediately and ruled in my favor. Karen was ordered to pay $52,000 for property damage and restoration, $10,000 in legal fees, and she had to issue a formal written apology. The best part? The HOA removed her from the board due to misconduct and community disruption. As for me, I planted a new oak tree right where the old one stood and placed a small plaque that says, "In memory of the old oak, may foolishness never cut you down again."